In 1919, a British general ordered his troops to open fire on a crowd of unarmed civilians. No warning. No order to disperse first. Just gunfire into a walled courtyard with no way out. When it was over, somewhere between 400 and 1,000 people were dead. The general who gave the order was never imprisoned. He was later celebrated as a hero back home, with a public fund raised in his honor. This is the Amritsar Massacre. And it's just one chapter in a much longer story the British Crown has spent a century trying to keep quiet. For most people, the monarchy means castles, coronations, and corgis, pageantry with a smile. But behind the ceremony sits an institution built on empire. An empire runs on force. To understand the crown, you have to understand what it was actually built on. Start at the beginning. The British Empire didn't expand through polite negotiation. It expanded through companies chartered directly by the monarch, given legal permission to conquer, tax, and exploit entire regions in the crown's name. The Royal African Company, founded in the 1660s under a royal charter, transported an estimated 150,000 enslaved African people across the Atlantic, more than any other single institution in the history of the slave trade. The monarch at the time wasn't a distant beneficiary, he was a shareholder. That pattern, power delegated through royal charter, profits flowing back to the crown, accountability flowing nowhere, repeated for centuries. And it didn't stop when slavery ended. It just changed shape. In Bengal, in 1943, a famine killed an estimated 3 million people. Grain was still being exported out of the region during the height of the starvation, some of it for the war effort, some of it simply because officials refused to divert it. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister and a close advisor to the crown, was informed repeatedly of the scale of the deaths. Relief was delayed for months. Historians still debate exactly how much of the famine was policy versus catastrophe. But what isn't debated is that the crown's government had the power to act faster and didn't. And then there's Kenya. In the 1950s, during the Mau Mau Uprising, the British colonial government ran a network of detention camps. Documents that surfaced decades later, after the British government initially claimed they didn't exist, revealed systematic torture, beatings, castrations, sexual assault, carried out under direct colonial administration. In 2013, the British government formally admitted torture had taken place and paid compensation to over 5,000 elderly Kenyan survivors. It took nearly 60 years for that admission to happen. Here's where it gets stranger, though. It's not just what happened, it's what happened to the paperwork. In 2011, a British High Court case forced the release of a set of files known as the Migrated Archives, thousands of documents that colonial officials had deliberately shipped out of soon-to-be independent countries in the final days of empire, specifically to keep them out of the hands of new governments. For decades, the Foreign Office had told historians and researchers that these files simply didn't exist. They existed. They'd been sitting in a secret government facility the entire time. The operation to conceal them had a name, and it was treated as a matter of national security for over half a century. That's the mechanism that keeps repeating across this institution. Not one scandal, pattern of controlled information, deny, delay, and if the truth eventually surfaces, treat it as ancient history rather than an open wound. And the pattern didn't stay in the past. It followed the family into the modern era. In recent years, Prince Andrew's relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein became one of the most scrutinized modern royal scandals. Andrew was photographed at Epstein's properties years after Epstein's first conviction. He gave a televised interview attempting to explain the relationship that was widely regarded as a disaster and effectively ended his public royal duties. A civil case brought against him by Virginia Giuffre was settled out of court in 2022 with no admission of liability, a resolution that left the underlying questions publicly unanswered rather than resolved. Notice the shape of it. Not a courtroom verdict, not a full public accounting, a quiet financial settlement, and an institution that closed ranks around one of its own rather than opening the door to real transparency. That's really the through line connecting a 1919 massacre, a 1943 famine, a 1950s torture campaign, a hidden document vault, and a 21st century settlement. It isn't that the crown is uniquely evil among institutions. Plenty of governments and empires share this history. It's that the crown was specifically built with mechanisms to prevent accountability from ever reaching the top. Ministers took the blame, generals got quietly retired, documents got shipped overseas or filed away as classified, and the institution at the center kept its hands technically clean generation after generation, no matter what happened underneath it. Even the coronation itself is designed around this. The monarch stands above ordinary law, legally immune from criminal prosecution in the UK by long-standing convention, not because the person is incapable of wrongdoing, because the office was built centuries ago to be unreachable by the systems that would hold anyone else responsible. So when people talk about the secret crimes of the monarchy, it's worth being precise about what's actually secret. Most of this isn't secret at all. It's documented, litigated, admitted to, sometimes even formally apologized for. What's actually hidden is something quieter. The machinery that made sure none of it ever touched the people at the very top. That's the real inheritance. Not a crown, not a title. A 500-year-old system for making consequences disappear before they reach the throne. The empire is gone. The colonies are independent. The uniforms and the charters are history, but the mechanism. Deny first. Delay as long as possible. Settle quietly if it can't be denied. That part never really retired. It's still running, just with better public relations. And as long as an institution keeps deciding for itself what history gets remembered and what gets shipped off in boxes marked confidential, the real story of the crown will keep getting rewritten by the people it was never allowed to hold accountable.